Thank you, everyone who has joined us today from all over the world right now. Good morning and good evening, and welcome to today's session. This is session 4 of our series on the latest evolution of applied neuroscience, and we're so glad that you're here. Steve, I'm going to have you go to the next slide. And again, thank you for joining us. We also have today on our panel some of our international partners. So we are so glad that they're joining us here today. We have LearnFast, who is based in Australia. They serve Australia and New Zealand. We have Stronger Brains, that's from here in California. Brain Maps is based in Shanghai, and then we have BrainFit, which is based in Singapore, but they also serve Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Turkey. And we could not do this without them, so we're so glad that they're here as well on our panel. The next slide, Steve. So just want to introduce your panelists. We have Alex Kitsis, who is a clinical psychologist and co-founder of Stronger Brains in the US. We have Cheryl Chia, who's a physiotherapist and founder of Singapore-based BrainFit, and Dave Stanley, who's the director of learning ecosystems at LearnFast Australia. Next. And then, of course, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, who is also one of the founders of Elite Performance Solutions, Steve Miller. Steve works as an applied neuroscientist and technology executive with more than 25 years of industry experience. Dr. Miller has authored and co-authored more than 100 publications, including numerous multi-site research studies, commercial software programs, and US patents. The majority of his patents have been licensed, brought to commercial practice, and in 2000, he was the co-recipient of the Thomas Alva Edison Patent Award in Medicine for his work. As a business executive, he is a passionate collaborator with broad business experience in technology transfer and translational research. So thank you, Steve, and welcome. And we're going to go ahead and let you get started.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks to all the partners, and thanks to everybody tuning in to watch this morning. It's a great pleasure to talk to you about some of the stuff that, of course, I really enjoy. And today I'm going to try to cover some ways that we enhance learning. I'm going to focus on attention and memory. Previously, I've talked about some of the other elements that impact learning and memory, but I'm not going to focus on those today. But again, if you look back in some of our earlier presentations and work, there are some topics that have been covered under this domain with BrainFit, and I know that LearnFast had me give a talk, and we discussed the role that nutrition plays, of course, exercise, the big fundamental role that sleep plays. But today we're going to talk about learning engagement as the primary focus. And so I wanted, unlike some of my other talks, I wanted to give you some actual operational tips that you can apply to improve learning so that you could start the minute this is over and think about what you're doing to try and learn something that you're trying to gain mastery in, or that somebody that you work with or a child is working on. And so the first thing I wanted to point out to you was what we call the learning curve, right, or the forgetting curve. This is from Ebbinghaus's work really long time ago, over 100 years ago, where Ebbinghaus showed that when you're trying to learn a certain amount of content, that after learning the content the first time, so if you are trying to learn words in a new language, let's say you learn 20 new words, so you at the end of a training session, you know those 20, what's the percentage of words that you know when you're tested later? So it always depends on content. So some content is more engaging or easier for you to learn. So it's always a percentage of what that content is. And some of the decay in remembering is based on how engaging or how confusable that content might be. But in Ebbinghaus's example, Um, he shows something that within the first day, he's down to about 33% of the content left. And so you can see that you have a very quick learning loss. And in his case, he was trying to learn words, new words. At the end of 6 days, he only remembered 25% of the total that he remembered on the first day. So this is called a learning curve. So you can think about, teaching a child math facts, history, or something else. And we're going to talk about studying it once. What's the interval between studying it a second time? And what's the retention interval, right? So if you're studying in college, this is Hal Pascher's work, by the way. So if you're studying in college, the final exam might be a given date, and you're studying the material. And then the question is, how often do you want to study that material again to maximize your retention interval to do well on that test? And so again, we're going to talk about the percent correct recall. In this case, this person's trying to learn Swahili to English vocabulary. There's a 10-day retention goal. Here there's some facts. Think of it as like social science, but the retention interval is 6 months, or names of objects that are new objects like vocabulary. So a child might have a spelling test, a vocabulary test. And what they found pretty consistently was that the retention period, so the practice period that you want to have, is about 10 to 20% of the time period to when you want to maximize your recall. So if it's a 6-month recall, somewhere around half a month, you want to be studying. So every half a month, and then a little bit faster as you get closer, because those 10% marks will get faster. But you want to see that retention curve to improve. You want to be studying about 10 or 20% of the time. So again, you can think about looking at your calendar. When's the end of your exam? When's the high stakes test? And plotting out what your study period would be. It's about 20%. So if it's 10 days away, 2 days after the first learning, you would be studying again with testing on those first items. So you're going to study a lot, but how often are you going to bring back those original items to be restudied? And so, again, too little spacing, so too quick spacing. So studying at 8 a.m. in the morning, and then those initially learned items again at 10 a.m. if the test is in 10 days, wouldn't yield you the benefit as studying at 8 a.m. on Monday and then studying at 8 a.m. on Tuesday if the test is 10 days away. Okay. This is one of my favorite slides. For some of you who know that a lot of our work is also not just with struggling learners, but with elite learners, and the content is in sports. So I work with Kim Vernon and Tom Nugent and others on some of our work with elite athletes. And so there was a study done down at Stanford University, which is physically just down the road from me. And the question was, how does one combine exercise, studying, and the possibility of a nap to improve a memory score, right? So in each case, we have the score of in memory, and they found a significant result. And the significant improvement was when exercise was done in the morning, then studying, then the nap. So without a nap, you actually get the lowest score. So this shows the importance of memory in helping us consolidate learned information with exercise preceding it. When we have no exercise and we have studying with a nap, so again, sleep, we see a slight improvement, but a significant improvement. But the most improvement was exercise. So again, the brain is about 2% of your body weight, but it's about 20% of the resource needs of your body. So exercise, which helps build those resource needs up, is very important long-term in building an effective learning. So a little bit of morning exercise, followed by some studying for the content you want to learn, a nap a few hours later, and you see the highest performance on the subsequent memory test. So Learning is not simple. There's a lot of complicated factors and variables in there, but I just wanted to give people the idea. And then, as we've talked about before, sleep, if you have disrupted sleep, so you have abnormal sleep, bad sleep, you can actually impact this score 30 to 50%, especially in older adults. So you might do really well cramming for an exam to do well, but in absolute retention of that information and learning it, sleep is absolutely critical in consolidation of learned material. So it's one of my favorites. Next, I'm going to talk about some new tools that we're using to enhance engagement. So again, I work in the applied neuroscience space. I want to just remind you of how some of this work happened. This guy predated me, but he was pretty much the most famous subject in the neurosciences. So this man worked in construction on railroads. His name's Phineas Gage, and he had an incident where the pole in his left hand actually went into his skull. He lived, survived it, but it disrupted his frontal lobes, and he had severe emotional outbursts and problems subsequent to that. And that became one of the most famous cases for people to study. And today, if you go into, a friend of mine is the director of neuroscience at UC Berkeley. He has a reconstruction of Phineas Gage's skull that shows you exactly where the injury happened. That the reason being that that's how prominent a role his famous case plays. You can see individual scientists around the globe who will have purchased or own, a plastic brain so they can talk about the parts of the brain, and Phineas Gage's skull reconstruction so they can talk about that work. And then initially, a long time ago when I was a student, this slide was one of the bigger ones, which was when you asked people to do different tasks, looking versus listening versus thinking about a topic, remembering, or working on a problem. You saw different patterns of brain activation. This was, of course, heartening because it meant that we could use tools to better understand how different parts of the brain became active. I want you to kind of think about this one and remember it, because when I show you what tools show us today, you'll see why we have such an acceleration in our knowledge base in this area. This is actually somebody, we can't forget the individual patients who allow us to study the healthy parts of their brain before they have a diseased part of their brain operated on. That work is called ECOG for cortical studies. We actually number the parts of the brain and there's recordings done, but it helps us to know what's happening inside the brain from these patients, because it helps inform our models for studying the brain without having to do surgery. And today, when we put on an EEG cap, right, this is a completely harmless listening cap. Today we do it without the wires. When I was in graduate school, and for the past 20 years, I've done lots of work with the wires connected while people do activation tasks, and we track their eye movements. We do a bunch of complicated math elements. This is with an organization called Intheon, one of our partners at Elite Performance Solutions. And then we can actually build these cortical maps. So a minute ago, I showed you what the maps look like when people are thinking. Now I can walk up to somebody, put on a headset, and I can study the executive control network in their brain, their attention network in their brain, or what we call the baseline or default mode. So the baseline mode in their brain would be asking somebody to close their eyes and not think hard about any specific topic, but just relax. And we record their brain, and then we compare what their brain is doing when they're having those kind of, sitting there thinking quietly moments versus when they're actively trying to elaborate or incorporate information that's new or focus. Some of my early work, which many of you are already aware of, was with a product called Fast Forward. In this case, to enhance attention and processing of information, we actually systematically altered the information in the natural environment to slow it down. So in this case, we would emphasize and slow down the fast-moving parts of speech, the consonants versus the vowels, and we would exaggerate that to 200%. That increased attention to the information, right? It sounds different. It also made it easier to process for many children and adults, and had some significant improvements in the way people who have a stroke and have language understanding problems. It enabled them to learn language better, language they had acquired but lost due to an injury, as well as allowed children who didn't know English learn it faster as a second language, or individuals who had learning issues. From that work and from the work of others, this is work published by Cunningham and Keith Stanovich. Very famous work, which I want people to understand. Some people call them Matthew effects. So if you hear about that in the literature, that's what they're talking about. What I wanted to show you here was one of the challenges, not to create frustration, because if you're a parent, this can freak you out, but to give you the idea that systematic continuous improvements can yield enormous benefits. So when you look at individual children who read, one of the challenges is not just what they do when they're in school, but what do they do when they're not in school? How much reading do they really participate in when they're outside of school? And that varies enormously. So children who are good readers read outside of school. In this large study, they read about 65 minutes a day on their own for fun. In a year, that reading resulted in about 4 million more words in exposure than someone else. Children who read at the 30th percentile in the United States only read about 2 minutes a day. So their exposure due to that on their own reading was about 106,000 words, right? So it wouldn't matter if we're talking about swinging a baseball bat and you're trying to get better, or trying to learn to read, or trying to do math. People that are good at it tend to do it more often for fun than people who aren't so good at it. That impacts engagement. Those compounding effects are enormous. So not only is it a challenge, in school when children are reading, but when they come home, children aren't static, right? Good readers continue to read more and move even further ahead. So if we can improve just 10 minutes a day of reading time for a child, again, not adversarially, not negatively, but a positive reading environment. If we can take that child who only reads 2 minutes a day and get them to read 10 minutes a day, their exposure can be about 700,000 words a year or more, right? And so that exposure alone in 10 minutes moves them up to a US reader for fun at the 70th percentile. So this compound reading is really a big bonus, right? So this, again, when we think about anything, it's really about that consistent commitment to working daily on an activity that yields the benefit. It's not just about trying to catch up, but it's about trying to put in those good behaviors for learning. So when we've been studying, and Dave Stanley has helped us with some of this, when we've studied elite professional athletes, what we learn is not just that they're good at practice with the coach around, but the things that they're doing outside of practice are yielding these additional benefits. So believe it or not, when we measure the attention span and the attentional focus of elite athletes, they have an enormously good ability to attend. Now, that doesn't mean that they attend to reading, but what they're able to attend, they're actually able, they have a high attention brain. So elite learners and elite athletes share something in common, and that is they're able to focus their attention when they want to. Now, we have some really good news, and this is one of the more famous slides in neuroscience, and this is the idea that you can have brain maps. And even in adults, so this was in an adult brain, not in a child's brain, in a mature brain, you can see map expansion through training. So here are areas of the brain that have been labeled that identify actually for a motor movement. And we see that with behavioral training, we see a map expansion as at the expense of training. And so because we started to have ways to measure these specific map expansions, we could identify how much training need to occur, that it needed to be adaptive, right? You don't want to work on easy stuff all the time. You want to be challenging yourself, because if you're not challenging yourself, you're often not motivated. We want to have discriminating neural activity. So we want to have a way to not just have adaptive, but we want to be able to differentiate what we're doing. So we want to know that it's different so that we're able to focus on it. It can't just happen spontaneously. And it needs to be rewarded. We need timely motivation. So in the brain, what's motivation? We need to have feedback that happens really within a few seconds or less than a second. We need, the faster that feedback can be, and it has to be accurate feedback, the better that map expansion occurs. So we start to figure out what these learning models are. And again, just to point back, you know, we had animal research, we had human research from patients, and then we had the normal training and development. I studied over 500 children for 5 consecutive years before they started school, all the way through 3rd grade, every year, several times, looking at their brain maps, studying their reading and their behavior to come to a lot of these conclusions that resulted in products like Fast Forward. And then, of course, in science, we want to validate this. So this was a study done at Stanford University. This young boy is actually watching a video of an animation called Shrek. So if you know the Shrek cartoon, movie, he's watching a Shrek video. And then we're going to ask him, we're going to replace the Shrek video with some questions on the screen, and we're going to record his brain activity while he reads, or he practices a reading activity. So when we look at his individual brain, this is what it looks like. And we're going to look at the activation spots for reading. So we actually have a reading area of the brain, right? Reading is invented. So these are language areas that result in or support reading. When we average a bunch of brains together, the wrinkles won't line up, and so we get these smooth brains. And so what we saw in a normal good reader was an activation pattern that's really absent in struggling readers, an inability to activate this area consistently. So again, when we think about attention and focus, it's not that they can't activate the area, they just can't activate it on average in a reliable way. After training, we saw activation in that area, and we see the area for the group of brains showing a growth in this domain. This was a published study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, actually 2 studies. Lise Temple, who was at Stanford at the time with John Gabrielli, and a group of people in 2000 and 2003. And this was the product Fast Forward, the first time ever that a commercial product showed that we could change the brains of individuals. Now, again, the good news is we can do this with adults. So at Elite Performance, we now do this with corporate adults. We do corporate executives. We teach them how to focus during brain training. And we talk about what kind of physical activity they need to do, elements about diet, right? How to have neuroprotection, how to hopefully increase the performance of their brain in a healthy way. What I've talked about before is the Mediterranean diet appears to add quite a few years to your cognitive health. And again, we can study this in active brains without having to even cut your hair. So that we can look at these brain maps build, and you get feedback on how that's helping your brain actually become a higher performing brain. And we can do that at 50 or 60. Here is one of those individuals. He was actually in his 40s at the time. But again, he's a healthy scientist down, was at UCLA at the time. And we recorded his brain activity when he was engaged, doing a task well, and to when he was making mistakes because he was losing his focus. So we'll call that the engaged brain and the disengaged brain. What we see was in an engaged brain is we see a lot more activity in the alpha and theta range, a ratio of activity that's different across the 2 brain areas. So we can build a math model of brain activity to look at engagement versus disengaged, right? So in the alpha range, we have an engaged brain that looks like this. Disengaged, we see the huge differences here, as well as in the theta range. And again, you had Ed Hamlin give a talk, and he talked exactly about these frequencies and neurofeedback training that they do. Okay. This is one of our favorite examples of children that are going to do better than others early in development based on how well they can delay gratification. And so this was a study done down the road again at Stanford called the marshmallow test. In the initial example, what you do is you show children two choices. They can have one marshmallow now, or they can have multiple marshmallows later. And if they can just wait 15 minutes. And so which one do they want? And the children who choose to wait and delay their gratification don't stare at the multiple marshmallows. They try and do things to distract themselves, but they stare at the marshmallow that they have to not focus on, creating moments of frustration, challenge. Here's a boy closing his eyes to shut off his desires, and you can see some of the kids succumb to the pressure and eat that individual marshmallow. What they found was that in these young children, right, and again, this isn't something we're training, we're talking about observing the normal development of the ability to delay gratification. Children that can do this will tend to do better in school. Right? Again, why? Because we can talk to them about doing their homework tonight to delay the gratification of higher performance on a test. Children that have to choose between homework and doing something fun in the evening, that's not delayed. They often choose the immediately gratifying, game or doing something different instead of working hard for that delayed gratification. Good or bad news, I have two sons. That's good news for me. The bad news is boys develop much slower than girls. So that delayed gratification naturally comes in a little bit later. And parts of those executive skills actually will continue all the way up into the 20s. We know what that charting is, but when we measure that part of the brain, what we call the executive decision-making part of the brain, what we see is that it develops normally all the way into the 20s for young men, quite a bit earlier actually for women. But and of course, we hold people accountable differently when they're 5 and teens and 20s because of that decision-making ability, right? We don't think of a 5-year-old as having to have the same decision-making as a teen or a 20-year-old. I just want you to understand that when you think about decision-making and providing choices, et cetera, we really don't stop at the preteen levels with that growing part of the brain. It's actually growing a lot in the teenage years and even the 20s. So for those people who want to provide guidance, guidance continues into the 20s. I have personal experience on that. And when we talk about this model of what the brain looks like, right, we have what we would call the brakes, right? The thinking part of the brain provides brakes on those decisions about things that we might want to do for immediate gratification. And then we have the accelerator part. So what we've noticed in athletes, what we notice in learners, what we notice in various syndromes is that the coordination or balance or building up the strength of that system is really what we're talking about with impulse control and attention. It's delayed gratification, it's the ability to focus and learn, right? And so the braking system, as people get older, gets a little weaker. When we're a teen, we have extra accelerator systems, right? We have those hormones pushing that accelerator system in. And I'm sure that there's various clinical syndromes that Dr. Kitsis works with that deal completely with an imbalance in one or more of these systems. It could be a bad braking system, too much of a braking system, too much of an acceleration system. So it varies in normal development, but that's what we're talking about building in these cases. In my case, here's a wireless system. I'm going to just show you, sorry. You can see this takes about 90 seconds to put on. And then we can track a learning game or an activity. And this is completely about the accelerator braking system. We don't allow Coca-Colas in our studies. So this was a bad news thing, but we have Bluetooth here talking to the headset. and we're going to watch him make a decision, and we're going to have a machine learning system going on over here, and you can easily see that there's a particular electrode, particular part of the brain that's contributing most here. Over here we have the machine learning going on. This is from our friends at Intheon doing this study, and they're able to correctly predict good and bad responses, so accuracy in the task. And that has allowed us to take that model with our partners, right, and enhance that model for making something in real time to work. And of course, I want to go back to Dr. Rabner's talk on attention deficit disorder and the study that we've done there, and how that's aided us in working with kids today. So again, this is, you know, from just the National Institutes of Mental Health website. We have a definition of what is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Dr. Rabner talked about the inattention elements of it, the hyperactivity and the impulsivity. Remember from his talk, inattention is the one that probably causes us the biggest challenge in remediation. Lots of the medications that are out there have a bigger impact on what we would call the motor activity. It's easier to see, it's easier to build interventions for it. Inattention is harder to track. We try and track it with an EEG system so that we can track inattention, and therefore, of course, also you know, try to focus or attack interventions that impact inattention, which is that one that has the biggest negative prediction for academic performance. In this study, this was, we identified children who were good at language comprehension for learning words, kids that were bad at language comprehension. At pretest, everybody's not very good. They're all below 1 standard deviation in performance. We have 169 kids in the experimental group, 68 in the control. And we look at the use of fast forward for this group, and we see a significant improvement for the kids that got fast forward versus got a different intervention. This is work that Dr. Kitsis and I did together some years ago. And then we looked at individuals who had on the Connors checklist. So again, Dr. Rabner talked about a checklist that is a piece of evidence. It's not sufficient to identify ADHD, so we call these children at risk for ADHD, and they're at risk because they scored over a 60 on the Connors survey from teachers and parents. And so what do we see here that was important? We see that kids that are at risk can improve substantially in their language understanding using fast forward. Remember, we're going to now move from the wired systems to the non-wired systems to try and build a tracking mechanism so we can actually have an impact, like Ed Hamlin talked about, where we have neurofeedback training because we want to try and attack the inattention element specifically. So I did this with a school district where we have randomization and kids are trying to learn content from a video. Why am I using video? Video is not superior to a teacher, but I have more control over it. So I could actually study something with a teacher being blind to what kids were in what group. So when the teacher evaluated student performance, he or she wouldn't be biased in the results. And what we found in a math video of learning algebra, so this is content the students had never had before, is that the students that had neurofeedback showed a substantial improvement relative to watching the video multiple times. So in this case, the feedback is simply to let them know they're not paying attention so that they can turn up their focus while they're watching the video. To control for the total amount of time, because the neurofeedback condition was a little bit slower, we allowed kids to go back and watch portions again if they wanted to. Think about a YouTube video, so they're learning this information. The teacher then administers a test, comes back into the room to find out who was in what group, and was very impressed with two things. Number one was that the group that was receiving neurofeedback did better. As Dr. Rabner likes to remind me, we weren't changing the brain due to neurofeedback, but the insights into attention, into inattention, allowed the kids to become mindful, aware of their situation, and aware that they were not paying attention, and that allowed them to elevate their attention and learn more, in our opinion, in the study. So being mindful is great, but if I'm not paying attention, I often don't know it until after it's over. It's too late for me to know that I missed content. How do I rewind to the exact spot? Well, with having a wearable that tells me I'm not paying attention allows me to turn up my attention if I have that capability. And over time, we believe that will impact learning even more. So we're about to announce a new product that has this headband. This headband records your brain activity in EEG while you're using a device. And so you basically start this to monitor your attention and provide you with feedback for, let's say, 5 minutes of learning. And then it goes into the background on the computer and you can listen to music, do your reading homework, etc. And it'll give you an attention score. It'll also, if you're doing the feedback mode, it'll give you, it'll tint the screen darker or lighter as a function of your attention. So you'll be able to read, but you'll get feedback that something's going on in your attentional state and that you're hopefully getting better control after it. This is my data. Music was my highest attention score on this given day. Instrumental music listening to was my lowest. I'm not a music buff by any means. Second was after lunch was my lowest attentional period of the day. So in the morning, pre-caffeine, I'm a little bit lower. It goes up a little bit. And then right around lunchtime, my attention goes way down. After I eat, for me, it comes up higher and then that goes down more during the day. And feedback helps me a lot. So getting those little warning elements really provided me with some. I'm sure in the future we'll have a demo with this. And our partners are going to help us in getting feedback on it so that we can build something that really works for everybody involved. And then just in closing, right, I want to just talk about that, we now have new opportunities to induce or maintain or even reverse prior learning to achieve outcomes of higher performance, right? And we're doing this now, like I said, we're doing this with individuals that have, in essence, a deficit. Maybe they had a cerebral accident, maybe they have a developmental disorder, maybe they have poor learning history, right? They weren't exposed to sufficient learning. And we now can take the prior learning and basically, restrict it from impacting new learning from happening and see those gains happen in the classroom. Again, we started that out with a product called Fast Forward. Now we're moving into other product areas. And now neuroscience is giving us new ways to facilitate learning in real time in the classroom using real learning content that students are going to be measured on. We think our Focus app is going to allow that, right? We're not just training the brain on content and hoping that it transfers. We're going to have transferable activities on the reading homework that you're going to be tested on as a student. So we can combine those things. It's not a choice as to whether it's a training program that is teaching you new content or whether it's tracking your learning. You can combine those two. So you can wear a headband while training with Fast Forward, or you can wear a headband and track your EEG while doing your math homework. We even have a way to let parents know what attention looks like while a child's wearing a headband working on their homework down the hall. And then we call this ultimate goal is to have closed loop learning. We want to be able to track working memory and attention and sequencing skills through the learning process and change content to maximize learning the most. Wouldn't it be great if content became more engaging in an interactive way? We don't have that yet, but we're hoping to get there. And so with that, I'm done. I'll go to the next slide and then I'll let Kim take over and let the panel beat me with questions.
Thank you, Steve. Always great to listen to you talk and love seeing familiar slides as well as new ones.
I'm going to track Dave Stanley's EEG now.
All right, and just a reminder to the attendees, due to the size of the group, we're unable to do a chat, but we do welcome you to post your questions in the Q&A. and we will maybe sharing some of those, or Tom Nugent is checking that Q&A and will be responding. If we don't get back to you during the session, we will get back to you afterwards. But let's go ahead and open to our panel, and please let us know what questions you have for Steve.
I'll start.
Dave, you're on mute, by the way, just to let you know, since he thinks he's talking, but Cheryl's going first.
I'm going first, Dave. Steve, again, another very interesting discussion. I thought that that the slides that you had at the beginning on space repetition was really interesting. So, so if my question is, if there wasn't like an endpoint, like you didn't have a time that you were going to take an exam, but if you just wanted to commit something to a long-term memory, then is there general recommendations for that? Would that be the usual, like 24 hours afterwards, like a day and then a week and then a month? Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So first of all, Cheryl, because I know you and Dave both will want it, I'm going to provide an article that summarizes all the spaced and sequenced learning for you. So this is Professor Rody Roediger, who's at WashU St. Louis, and was the editor of Cognition and Learning. So a lot of this is his work, and then Hal Pasher at UC San Diego. So there's a great summary of what works and what doesn't work. But to answer your question, I want to bring out and make sure that I made a point, because I probably didn't do that great of a job at it. So we're talking about how often to practice the stuff that we've already learned versus how often to work on new stuff, right? So let's assume that you speak more than a couple languages. I'm not very good at any real language. I question whether I'm actually good at English, but the point is, if I wanted to learn a language, a new language, I should probably be committing myself every day to a little bit of language learning in that domain. The question is, what percentage, like you're saying, there's no real test for me. I'm an old man, right? My test is going to be my trip to that country, or when I meet somebody who's going to have that, and I may not know when that is. So on Monday, I learned 20 words in Mandarin. On Tuesday, I want to try to learn another 5. So I'm going to spend a certain amount on my new content, and then how much gets spent on the old content. The learning curve is really about the old content study. And so the question would be, you want to commit a certain amount of time to that and a certain percentage. And I would say that, what the research really says is you should be revisiting some of the prior content, about 10% of it. Well, that content gets bigger over time, right? And your new words is going to stay hopefully consistent, right? So, but you have this idea that I go from 20 words. Well, what's 20% of 20 words? I'm going to study 4, right? But then I have 120 words I've learned. Now I'm going to be studying only a few words. So the question is how much old content to bubble into my new content training. And I would say you're really going to look at the old content every couple days, right? You don't really need it. You definitely don't need to do it every day, right? And so when does new content become old content? These are kind of fuzzier variables. And so what they've really done is, we have a lot of data, and Tom Nugent has worked with special operators trying to learn languages really quickly in weeks, where, it's a mandate. You have 6 weeks to learn as much of this language as you possibly can, because you're going to be sent on work to a new country, right? And so we're really used to defined timelines. Less is known about those other elements because we don't have the high stakes evaluation. But I would really say you're talking about probably every 3 to 4 days, maybe every week, you're revisiting some of that earlier studying content. And the real key is to evaluate yourself on it, to make sure that you're constantly studying prior learning as well as some of the new stuff. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
As an extension of that, great question, Cheryl. Steve, what's the advantage of artificially imposing deadlines on yourself when you don't have an exam, but is there an advantage from the way the body applies stress that will help you learn it more effectively?
Well, right. So you provided a big chunk of the answer, right? And that is you're creating a performance criteria, which if it's meaningful to you, it creates pressure. Um, Pressure can be good stress because it can push you to achieve things that otherwise you wouldn't normally achieve. Bad stress is when it's not under your control. So your situation, we're identifying a good stress situation, right? I'm self-imposing a limit, whether it's to achieve a certain physical outcome. You know, I want to be able to run a mile in a certain amount of time, or I want to learn enough words to go to Paris and speak there at a conference, you know, and be able to greet people, you know, appropriately. So you self-impose certain criteria and pressure, and of course you would want to do that. And I think, you know, very often that's why if I get a tutor, they're going to have a test for me, right? So part of the reason why we want to be evaluated, why we want to have trackable data, is that we can hold ourselves accountable to certain performance goals. It doesn't help if we shift those goals, right? If we go to the learning gym, so to speak, and we just pick and choose whatever we did that day and go, I achieved because I did something. Well, something is better than nothing, but it's better to have a program, right? And what I've discovered, and I'm sure you know what your learning centers have discovered, is that there's a performance pop if we have somebody external to us providing those performance goals. As you know, we spoke to a parent the other day, and we talked about the idea that sometimes you want to be a parent and not the performance coach. So how do you do that? Well, you have teachers, you have other parents maybe who can help. There's ways that you can identify performance goals so that you can be the parent and say, yeah, that's a tough goal. I understand. You know, we should talk to your coach this way about it, even if that coach is a teacher, right? Where if you're both the teacher and the coach and the parent, the child doesn't have anybody to go to complain about the teacher being unrealistic in setting high performance goals, right? So sometimes it's really good to, in essence, outsource some of that learning, to go to a learning center, to go to a training center and get that external goal setting, because you know, creates normal pressure in a fun, more positive way to get those outcomes, and those people have experience. So I think that's why we see those kinds of gains. So it's a great question. Thank you.
No, mate, I really appreciate you stringing together in 20 minutes a summary of all your neuroscience experience and the literature over the past 30 years. Awesome. Love the feel of this. This is so much more comfortable than a whole bunch of the other devices that you've exposed me to over the years. So I'll keep that on for a bit longer. It's, you know, literally, I almost look sporting as I put my head in the game. Question for you, literally, technology. We're all old enough that we did all our learning, even pre-calculators, let alone computers and learning devices. So neuroscience, as you said, the fundamentals, really good sleep, really good nutrition, combining exercise, getting the sequence of those things in the right order if you really want good learning to happen. Why technology? You know, we've done a lot of learning in analog. Why technology? Why this stuff?
Yeah, so that, I mean, great question. And I think the different way of phrasing it is, what's the consequences of technology? Because we're never going to get the choice to remove it, right? So what's happening that's different? I was discussing with Dr. Kitsis that, you know, millennials now are opening up their screens and have all these tabs in their browser, which used to be, you had to read a book, think about it, decide if you wanted to spend money to get a copy of it, get in line for the photocopier. It was a big effort. So you absolutely read that article. There was no, you know, I mean, you would have some waste, but it was very minimal. Nowadays, we just open a browser. We save it on our computer and we do a search for it later. We're not putting as many things as deeply in memory. We're not engaging the content as much as we used to, because it's all out there for us, right? We don't need to remember facts about the Olympics. We can look it up in Google, right? So that's happening naturally. I don't know that it's a good thing, right? But I think you're going to have depth of learning be much more connected to the engagement level of individuals. So we're going to have a lot more people who have a lot of depth of learning in particular domains, Maybe the use of an app or playing a game on a computer will be a depth of learning element. More than we're going to have the broad brush of what I would call the liberal arts student, where they're well read in various domains and know lots of things about who Bernoulli was, or the family competitions that went on to drive mathematical competitions, or awards that Newton went after, or why Galileo did something, right? Because now we're just going to bring up the picture and go, wow, cool image, and then go to the next page, right? Or go to Wikipedia and see what 11 people thought about the image, and whether that connected with us. So I think the unfortunate part is we're outsourcing our memory, right? We're not learning how to read a map. We're not remembering directions because we don't need to. And I don't know that we'll ever need to, for things like that kind of element, except for people who are really into maps. And there are people who love that. Nowadays, computers talk to somebody, I get in their car, they drive me somewhere, they don't even know the area themselves. You can't ask them anything about an area because the little computer is telling them. It's our first robots telling people how to do their job, right? Which is Uber and DoorDash and delivery services. And so the world is changing, and I can't predict that. Lots of people talk about it. It's really a separate talk in its own right. But I would say that you're getting a lot depth of processing is becoming different. And we're getting a lot more individuals who build expertise in a very narrow silo as compared to broad brush learners. But again, I don't know the consequences because so much of it is available, right? I would say her name, but if I say Alexa's name too loud, she'll start talking in the other room. So I have to be careful with that, or the ads on my television will change, right? And I'll get an email from somebody saying, I heard you want to buy something because Alexa said you do, right? So that it really is changing, and it's a different environment. I can't predict for you what it is. All I can tell you as an old man, we all were told that spelling would never matter because computers would correct everything for us. And now spelling matters more than ever because computers autocorrect for us and make huge faux pas in the world, right? We had a computer pay the wrong people $500 million the other day because of a mistake, right? So the mistakes can now be huge when we have miscommunications. Because everything is automatic. But thank you for the question. That's a great one. I do want to get to some more people though. So,
Dr. Miller, if I can just ask, great presentation. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about the role of reward in engagement, like for a kid? Because the research that you demonstrated showed that the kids improve in their ability to focus, right? They can improve. Do you think that's still in the absence of a reward? Like for instance, if you focus on reading, if you keep your focus for X amount of time, you're going to get this, right? Do you think that's necessary? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that you want to go. Most of us move from external rewards, so we connect somebody's commitment to a process of improvement to an external reward, and then we hope that that becomes internalized. When it becomes internalized, that's when an individual becomes kind of a self, pushing element, right? You get lost in the story. You think the story's almost real when you're reading science fiction, and you think about how it, projects to your own life circumstances or what the future might be like. And you get lost in the story because now you've internalized the reward system. You might have externalized that reward system when a child was very little. So nobody's ever told me not to share this story about my children, but my children didn't get an allowance for doing a chore with the dog or cat. They had to feed the animals in the house because they were part of the family. But my children did get compensated for reading. So they could only buy Christmas gifts for the family with money they made out of reading books. That was the entire only way they had a commitment to doing that. And so they got a penny a page. And I had to talk with them, or their mother would talk to them about the content in the book. So I was this mean parent who said, you read? Well, my kids read all the time. They loved to read. And they loved getting that. Now they became internalized readers, right? And now I have, a 25 and a 27-year-old who are reading, a book every 2 weeks. and talking about the next book they're reading. Now, I don't know how that came up. And my wife and I both read, but they both read more than us. And so I think you have to set an external goal about, what would you like to be good at? What school or university might you want to go to? Even if it's a far reaching one that they can't go to. Kim Vernon knows that when my kids were in 2nd and 3rd grade, I was printing out applications to any university they ever named. I would go look up right away how you got into that school. And we would talk about how hard it was. Right. And then I found my youngest going to look up schools. When he heard about a school, he'd say, Dad, I think I can get into, and he would name a school. And all of a sudden I was like, see, he doesn't think about not going to school. He thinks about what school. And now he's looking at what are the things that you have to do, and that, oh my goodness, somebody's going to measure me to see if I'm a fit to go to school. Right. It wasn't me doing it. It was other external factors. Then all of a sudden we're guiding him along and saying, well, maybe we need to play a sport a little less because you only have 6 lines of sports for that college. It wants you to have other activities. What's the language that you're going to be good at besides English? Because they care about that. And they'd say, I think I'm going to learn. And then they pick their language. So I think that you help guide that internalization, but they're going to pick it themselves. Right. And I think that the internet and the technology world allows that to go on a lot more. So there's a lot more sampling that goes on. So instead of going to university and discovering careers that you may have never heard of before because you grew up in a small town like I did, where everybody farmed, all of a sudden now you heard about jobs like neuroscience that never existed when I was in my town, where we didn't have a local doctor who lived in our town. He was in the neighboring town. So all of a sudden now I'm getting notes, Kim's nephew is going to talk to me about neuroscience next week, right? I'm getting young people who are learning about this stuff and they're reaching out, but that's through the internet. So, probably there's some girl in another country somewhere who today is learning about neuroscience and going, I wonder how I learn about it. I'm going to join a group on Facebook and I'm going to be, reading more about that and exploring it and getting excited about their area of interest. So I think that that's where we're going. So I think that we want to set up external goals. Like Dave said, we want to have tests and we want to identify what those tests are and have them as shared exams, right? So when a nephew or a parent or somebody went to a high school or a college and you talk about how good it is, how hard it is to get into, how does it evaluate? And you say, I don't know, I want to look. Right? When I went to school, my goodness, it was so much simpler than what it looks like now. And so I think that's how we internalize it, right? Shared values, you communicate those values and you talk about, where you go from there.
Thank you.
Hey, Steve, I got one quick question from the Q&A that I thought you'd be able to answer pretty quickly, related to auditory processing and learning around language. And the question was, one, is there any kind of exercises that can be incorporated to help with that? And 2, is that something similar to how you mentioned with executive function and how that maturates over time, where you would expect to see a change kind of over the developmental trajectory where that is no longer an issue?
That's a great question, and thank you. I think I can handle that one, so I'm gonna go after it in the sense that, so auditory processing, the speed at which you can incorporate and sample the external world, is something that is very highly developed early in life. That's good news. So we know that newborn babies can hear the differences in speech sounds in languages that they will not learn because nobody speaks that language in their home environment. This is the work of Pat Kuhl, K-U-H-L, at University of Washington. So babies are really universal speech detectors when they're born. They have the auditory capabilities to do that. And then through meaningful use, right, moms and dads and caregivers talking to babies up close and personal with exciting faces that move, babies learn to the sounds of the language that are used in meaningful ways, and they start to lose the ability to discriminate those other speech sounds because they're not as meaningful. And we have to recover that ability when we learn new languages. Again, work that I've done, work that got commercialized in the product Fast Forward, is used to help people learn English as a second language, because we're practicing English phonemes, as well as it is to help individuals who, despite hearing English and having it used in a meaningful context, never picked up those phonetic cues because maybe their speech sound didn't have as high a fidelity. Why? Middle ear infections. You can have a lot of fluid in the ear that sits there because the ear canals are flat and haven't tilted when you get, as you mature as an infant. That fluid sits in there. It's not an infection, so you don't know it, but it's blocking speech a little bit, and it's making it hard to build those meaningful connections. So you don't hear the differences in certain speech sounds, or they weren't used in your language because that language wasn't used early in your development. So Fast Forward can help slow speech down, and then as you get better and better, it gets faster and faster, so we get to normal speech speeds, and then you can build that up. So auditory comprehension, just like we showed with the ADHD kids, why are they having problems with learning to be language listeners? It appears that, having a good attentional system would matter, right? Especially if you're inattentive. You're not going to build those speech sounds as with such high fidelity. So what do? We give you a series of games that focus you on those speech sounds, just 2 speech sounds at a time, discriminating them, giving you a reward each time that you get it right. Gets easier and harder, and kids improve their performance pretty consistently. About 90% of kids will improve their performance in the first week or 2 in small gradations, and then that'll continue, and we see really nice results 2-3 years after stopping that intervention after just a few months. And that's what most of our learning partners do. It's what Stronger Brains does with adults, and we've seen that for individuals that are older adults who had good language but have a stroke. It impacts their language area, and then they're able to rebuild back that language area by using surrounding tissue around it. So, but thank you for the question, Tom. Whoever in the audience gave that, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, we're at about time. Did you go to the next slide? Did you want to introduce next week's session, Steve?
Yes, I did. I want to thank our partners, of course. So we have LearnFast, BrainFit, Brain Maps, and Stronger Brains. Without them, we wouldn't be doing this. And then Tom Nugent, who's on right now, is speaking on the 24th or 25th, depending on where you are on the planet. Please sign up for that. I've worked with Tom for a few years, and Tom has done really exciting work. Where my work initially started looking at average brains and below average brains, Tom has helped me to understand that the entire spectrum of performance can be utilized to build better exercises. So we went out and we've studied elite brains. So Tom has studied elite military operators, world-class rugby athletes, world champion athletes, people who have won prestigious awards in soccer and football and other domains. And to my surprise, even I was a university athlete. Tom was a better university athlete than me, but at university, what I learned about from the work that Tom's going to talk about is elite brains, whether they're in academic domains, or elite brains, whether they're in sports domains, share certain commonalities. So elite athletes have elite brains. Elite corporate executives have elite brains. And it's going to overlap with some of the stuff that we talked about today, which is, engagement and other kinds of elements like that. And so trust me, you won't want to miss it, especially if you want to get kids excited about the idea that they're working on their brain just the same way that Ronaldo works on his brain, or, Serena Williams, or, LeBron James, or you name the athlete. That so many athletes are now into brain training that I think it can really help motivate that child who thinks, why am I doing it? Is it because I'm not doing well in school? No, everybody is out there doing brain exercises now, not just individuals who find a weakness, but individuals who are trying to be the greatest of all time. So I look forward to Tom's talk. And I'll definitely be, sitting in on it, and it's February 24th or 25th, and hopefully you'll get a chance to tune in.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, this session is being recorded and we'll be sharing the link with you in the next day or so. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening.